Hey viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist and welcome back to Sir, You Are Being Hunted. This is episode 497. So of course, as usual, we're on the countdown here to episode 500, when me and Phil are hoping to do a Q&A in this game. Another one, that is, because we've done ones before in this game for, certain episodes. Now, so yeah, if you're interested in participating in the old Q&A and all that, do check the community tab on General Red Strategist on my channel page, because I left an actual thread on there, discussion thread, for anyone who actually wants to, have leave a few questions or whatever. So feel free to do that, or, if you want to, just leave a comment on one of these videos that says something along the lines of, oh, here's some Q&A questions, or a question or whatever. You can leave as many Q&A questions as you want. In fact, the more the better, I would say. So please do that. And of course, we're back here with our balloon experiment. So far, we are having very, very little success with this. Essentially, I think it just... I don't know how much longer I'm going to do this experiment for, because, like I say, it's taken a while. We're not having any real success with it. We got close to the balloon at one point, and we did find out that it is solid. You don't accidentally just like fall through it. It is actually something that you can physically touch in the game. But we weren't able to actually get onto it, because unfortunately we were on a crane. The balloon came very, very close, but it was still just a bit too high for us to actually jump onto. So I've actually come to a different island. I'm on the North Island at the moment. Because, you probably are looking at this island and thinking it's an industrial biome, but it doesn't look like the one you were on previously, Red. Well, that's your explanation right there. It is a different island entirely. So we're going to keep trying for the time being. I'm just going to explore this island, maybe see if there's anywhere we can climb up. There's the balloon there. Of course, the pylons are going to be useless to us because we can't climb them, or at least we can only climb up a certain distance, which is not enough. So if we can find a canal on this island, maybe we'll be able to climb up onto a crane and then maybe just wait and see if the balloon comes near at any point. The problem with this experiment is there's a lot, there's a lot of random chance, essentially. You just have to hope that there are high enough locations to be able to, well, get to the balloon, and that the balloon will then actually, come close enough for you to potentially get onto it. Is this a canal over here? It looks like it. Just got to search for cranes now, I do think. Should be able to find one, right? Somewhere around. Balloon's gone off over there, which is fine. We can just explore for the time being anyway. The crane's off over there. Wonder if there's ones further down this way. So, in the meantime, I hope you guys are all doing well out there, and you're looking forward to episode 500. Like I say, keep thinking of Q&A questions, and feel free to, put in as many as you want. Thing is, in the past, whenever I've done Q&As, usually the people who leave suggested questions, usually they don't just put one or two, they put like several in there, and that's absolutely fine. If you can't put 100 questions in there if you want to, well, me and Phil will try and get through as many as we can. No cranes here. Have I come to a bit of a duff island here? I'm not entirely sure. No cranes at all. It's a bit unusual. Usually on these industrial biomes you always get at least one or two. But we'll keep exploring for the time being. And, a map of the islands. Actually, that could come in very handy. I was actually just thinking about that in my head. Can we get a map of the islands somewhere? What exactly does a canal actually look like on a map? I've never actually really checked or thought about it. Let me just position myself like this at the sort of head of this canal. So it's basically, I guess it's kind of like the long dark patch on the map when you're on an industrial biome. So I'm assuming that basically is just saying, yeah, this is where a canal is, maybe. So that's what you got to look for on the maps, I guess. Interesting. Well, good to know. Alright, let's keep moving. Now, something actually I've been thinking about recently, and this is a bit of a random topic, I'll admit, but then again, a lot of my Sir, You Being Hunted podcast style episode topics are always pretty random. They're just, I have random thoughts and then I start talking about them, because why the hell not? But I was reflecting actually, just before starting this video, on the COVID pandemic. And I'm sorry to bring this topic back up again. Me and Phil have talked about it probably to death before on Sir, You Being Hunted, but thing is, I was just thinking about something striking about the rhetoric around COVID here in the UK. Because the thing is, obviously, COVID as kind of a news story has really faded away recently here in the UK over the last sort of few months. Because the thing is, very much what's occupying the news at the moment are things like the Ukraine crisis, obviously the Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. But COVID is just not figuring in the news anywhere near as much at the moment, or, at least not anywhere near as much as it did. And at least that's just from my own kind of experience. I mean, admittedly, I don't watch a lot of TV news, but I do look at, like, for example, BBC News website, things like that. And that, COVID doesn't seem to be talked about anywhere near as much on there. So it certainly seems like COVID as a news story has, died a little bit of a death. But the thing is, obviously, COVID hasn't gone away. It's still there, and we still need to be cautious about it. It's just obviously, because the vaccination rates have obviously gone up, and more people are generally immune to it now. And B, as a result of that, because it's not in the news as much anymore. I sometimes think that there is perhaps sometimes a risk of getting a bit complacent around the issue. People sort of just assuming that, okay, it's over, it's gone. Technically it isn't, and it's kind of funny because this topic got me sort of thinking about, when we were in lockdown, how there was so much argument about, whether lockdown was the appropriate solution for COVID. And I'm not going to sort of get into necessarily the weeds of whether it is or isn't, because I'm not a scientist. I'm a social scientist. I mean, just from my limited knowledge, I feel like the lockdown was necessary, even if it wasn't necessarily handled brilliantly, and even if the government could have brought it in much sooner than they actually did. But, putting that aside, as an academic, what's always fascinating to me with political issues is the way sometimes in which the subject of history is kind of drawn upon by different sides in a debate, and quite often how history is butchered and misinterpreted, or in some cases just flagrantly interpreted in ways that are just completely false. And the way it's used then to try and justify present day political positions, things like that. And I'm particularly thinking here about sort of the anti-lockdown side of the debate during the COVID pandemic. Because often, well, I mean, let me give a bit of context. Here in Britain, of course, we are, I would say, kind of obsessed with the Second World War. And it's understandable. I mean, the Second World War was a major event in the history of Britain. And, not just the history of Britain. I'm not saying solely the history of Britain. It was a major event for a lot of countries. But, focusing on the UK context, it was a significant event because, well, for numerous reasons, really. Number one, because you could argue it was kind of the nail in the coffin of British imperialism, because after World War II, you basically saw the gradual decline of the British Empire, lots of colonies became independent, and, Britain became very much a middle power. It was no longer kind of a world great power. And so that was kind of significant because, obviously, depending on what side of the debate you're looking at, some would argue that the British kind of collective psyche, or elements of it, have maybe not really ever got over that, or adapted, and still sort of cling to beliefs that Britain is still a global power, when, let's be honest, it probably really isn't. But, so the Second World War is a pretty big moment in British history, and apart from being, obviously, the nail in the coffin of kind of Britain's claim to being a sort of global great power, it was also, I think, an example of a conflict where generally most people agreed we were on the right side of history, which, certainly for a lot of European countries, Britain included, is sometimes hard to actually think about, because quite often, prior to the Second World War, a lot of European states, Britain included, engaged in colonial wars, and they went around subjugating people. And so, of course, there's a lot of aspects of our history, I think, that we don't really talk about because they make us uncomfortable. And the reason it makes us uncomfortable is because, of course, we reflect on the things we did, and by our sort of standards now, we obviously it makes us uncomfortable. Now, I know, obviously, in history you can't always sort of apply present-day morals and standards to past events. But the thing is, I would argue that it's understandable for people to be uncomfortable about a country's colonial past, because our present-day morals didn't just evolve in a vacuum. They came from somewhere. And the thing is, we sort of act as though anti-colonial sentiment is somehow unique to the present day, but it's not. Even within colonial powers, there were people who saw the subjugation and the exploitation that was going on and called it out, you know, and there were people who saw injustices happening and campaigned to try and stop them. I mean, like, the biggest example is the abolitionist movement in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Because the thing is, for a long time, slavery slavery of black people was often justified through imperial sort of racialist lenses. But even at that time, there were so many people whose views, frankly, would not have been not have been all that different, I would say, to our views today, in the sense that they saw it as immoral, and so they campaigned against it. Hence why I use the example of the abolitionist movement. But that's actually not the main topic that I want to talk about. I just sort of gone on a bit of a digression there, so let me just kind of park that aside for a moment. So, you know, getting back to the Second World War, because it's one of those kind of cases of where British people can feel like, oh yeah, we were definitely on the right side of history there. Obviously, as you can imagine, it gets invoked a lot in political discourse as an example of Britain being great, of Britain being morally just, and all this. And the thing is, that's what's also striking, obviously, about the Second World War experience in Britain is how it's often invoked as an example of the country coming together at a time of supreme emergency, of British people sort of knuckling down and getting on with things in the face of a huge threat, a potentially existential threat. And so, you know, nowhere is that kind of more exemplified than in this concept of what we in Britain would call the Blitz spirit. So, you know, throughout 1940 into 1941, as Britain was being bombed from the air, of course, you know, we were under huge threat. There was the threat was existential. We were being bombed from the air. Cities were being bombed day and night. There was also, you know, the ever-present threat of the U-boats in the Atlantic, destroying shipping, trying to basically create a stranglehold over the UK economy. And of course, you know, as you can imagine, people sort of had to come together there in order to be able to defeat that. At least that's kind of the popular narrative of it. And it's interesting, I find, how often the term Blitz spirit gets invoked in political discourse in the UK, and the way in which it's actually invoked. And it was often invoked, from what I can remember, during the pandemic, and it typically got invoked by people who were against the lockdown and who would argue things like, oh, you know, how did we do it in the Second World War? Look at us today, all panicking and going for all these crazy measures. You know, people in the Second World War, they just put their heads down and got on with life. You know, they had Blitz spirit and all this. And I always had a bit of a problem with when people say that, because quite often it felt like the way they were using the word Blitz spirit, they were sort of implying that despite the quite serious circumstances of the Second World War, people who say that, it feels like they're implying that life, in spite of that, just went on as normal. But it didn't, though, did it? Because to me that it smacks of a bit of historical illiteracy, because for many people in the Second World War in Britain, life did not go on as normal like it had done before the war. Life had to change, it had to be adapted. And if you look at the sheer amount of things that had to be done on the domestic front in the UK, it's quite striking how life changed. Because I mean, on the one hand, there's the obvious stuff like young men young men across Britain having to be conscripted into the army, being given the draft. Obviously, there's that, but there's also tons of other stuff as well, like the mass evacuation of children from the cities. They were put onto trains and just sent out into the countryside and billeted with sometimes just random houses out in rural towns and villages with complete strangers. And then, of course, there's things like rationing as well. The government basically setting limits on how much of each type of food you could buy each week in order to try and make the food supply last as long as possible in case the war in the Atlantic took a turn for the worst and merchant shipping was being sunk at a rate so fast that fresh supplies of food would not be able to meet up with demand and all that. And then, of course, there's the thing, about industrial production in the UK, factories being basically ordered to switch over all their machinery, all their production, to the production of munitions to help the war effort. And then, the role played by women in the Second World War. Women basically mobilised en masse, whether to, take over jobs from the men in the munitions factories, or to take up positions, for example, in the agricultural land army, or even to join the women's auxiliary services. For a lot of women, life changed. And of course, the other big change is that many families in the UK at that time, they lost loved ones to the war. Life would never be the same again after that. So, whenever I hear people sort of saying that, when people sort of invoke Blitz spirit from the past as though it's like an example of, we don't need lockdown measures because we're British, we're great at, just knuckling down and carrying on with life as normal, despite horrendous circumstances. I always have a bit of a problem with that because, to me, like I say, it feels like historical illiteracy. It feels like anyone with even a slight grasp of the sacrifices that people in the Second World War had to make, it feels like anyone with a slight grasp of that would know that that narrative doesn't really stand up. It can easily be critiqued and just deconstructed. Because the thing is, when it comes to fending off a pandemic, of course huge sacrifices are going to have to be made. If you've got something that's contagious, you need means to stop it transmitting. And the way you stop it transmitting is by encouraging, and if absolutely necessary, within reason, having to compel people to just behave in a certain way so that they're not, taking unnecessary risks. Now you say, I'm not arguing for something incredibly draconian here, don't get me wrong, but when you're in kind of an emergency situation, sometimes there are things you might have to do. But yeah, I mean, because the thing is, like I say, COVID has not gone away, and even though technically a lot of lockdown restrictions, not a lot, but pretty much all of them here in the UK have been gone now for a while. They were eased months and months and months ago. For example, wearing masks is no longer mandated. You don't have to. But yet, in spite of that, I still find myself wearing masks sometimes when I'm in shops, things like that. Just because, not because I'm like trying to sort of make a statement or anything like that. Not because I'm trying to sort of be holier than thou. That's not it at all. I'm just conscious that there are, people out there who are still technically clinically vulnerable. For example, like the elderly, or people with medical conditions that might make their immune systems weaker, or might compromise them. And I'm just aware, that they want to, they don't want to be shut up indoors week after week after week, because that's going to be pretty fucking bad for their mental health and all that. They do want to be able to come out just like the rest of us, and, come outdoors, get fresh air, visit people, visit friends, have some kind of contact with the outside world. And so, as a, able-bodied person, I do feel like I do still have a responsibility for actually making sure that I am doing what I can to sort of facilitate my fellow citizens' well-being. And if that means I have to wear a mask still sometimes, even if just voluntarily, then I'm fine with that. Plus, I also actually think that mask wearing has brought me a particular benefit, because I don't know about you lot out there watching this, but I've actually found, whilst I was wearing masks, I felt like my incidence rate of getting things like colds or suffering from excessive amounts of hay fever, I actually felt like that decreased whilst I was wearing masks. So, I feel like there's a personal benefit there to continuing to do so. And that's the thing, I'm not trying to be judgmental of people who choose not to. At the end of the day, it's their choice. But what I'm saying is that I just personally choose to keep wearing one for my own reasons, essentially. Because adaptations have to be made in order to, just do my bit, essentially. And if that makes me a good little obedient subject, then fine, you can say that. I won't contradict you on that front. But my motivation, I like to think, is informed by my own calm and collected thought on the matter, not by some knee-jerk reaction. But yeah, God, I went off on a bit of a rant here, didn't I? What started out as a historical topic suddenly became, something much more, I feel like, I was about to say something that feels much more political, but I feel like it really shouldn't be political, that. It should just be kind of, common practice, or, something which is so kind of common sense that people don't really sort of see it as a political issue. Sip some tea whilst I'm at it. There we go. Right, well, I've just sort of wandered around kind of blindly. I don't think this island really has any particular high points that I'm going to be able to climb up. Well, the previous island, which I think was the west one, was probably the best one actually to be on, at least so far, because of that high church roof. Well, that's unfortunate, but we're going to wrap this episode up here. This is episode 497 with me, a general red strategist. Hope you enjoyed that one, even though I was ranting a little bit. And yeah, like I said at the start, keep thinking of ideas for the 500th episode Q&A, and either leave them in the comments of this video, or find the thread that I've started on the community tab on my channel page, and maybe leave them under there. I mean, obviously it's still early days. I have a feeling that most questions will probably come in several days from now as we actually get closer to episode 500, but that's fine. In the meantime, Facebook and Twitter links down below, along with a link to my propagandist channel for anyone interested, and if you enjoyed, a like is always appreciated. But other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye, everybody. Maybe I want to stay sort of behind these, possibly, behind these tanks. Damn, I fucking love this game already. I've not even done 10 episodes of it yet, but it's really freaking good. Alright, where are we here? Observation Tower, General's Office, Distillery, Officer's Quarters, Latrine. Well, there's the front gate. We came sort of round this side, didn't we? Yeah, because there's the bunker. Then we sort of came in over here. Right. Yeah, because here's all like that bunch of tanks where we are at the moment. Alright, so bloody General's Office is right on the other side of it. So maybe we just have to go in like a big arc. I'm concealed. That's good to know. Okay, it's like fucking Assassin's Creed, isn't it? Oh, shit. There's a couple of them over there.